Minority and low-income communities have long faced environmental challenges. Can you briefly explain the major problems historically faced by these communities?
Okay, briefly. Well, going back a century, as land use and zoning became a tool that local governments used to determine where people would live, where industry would be built, etc. Baked into that process was a process of racial segregation. And so a lot of our zoning from the very beginning and a lot of our land use across the country was meant to keep whites and blacks from living next to each other, was meant to keep people of color from living next to white folks, immigrant communities, sometimes Catholics, sometimes Jews, depending on where you were. And stacked on top of that was a practice of building light industry, transportation, railroads, waste dumps, landfills, in those places where people of color and other quote-unquote undesirables lived. And to this day, that pattern and practice is still very much with us. And so when you add modern practices on top of that, you get very, very environmentally degraded communities.
Okay, so you have, like, for instance, incinerators,
highways, byways, landfills,
all going through
sewage treatment plants, chemical manufacturers, storage compartments, railroad areas where they just let the trains sit. We call them locally unwanted land uses, and every jurisdiction has them, but most people have no idea where they are because they're all concentrated in a few geographic locations.
Which are mainly African American and
mainly people of color, immigrant, low income,
and
tribal,
causing health hazards such as asthma.
Serious health hazards, cancer, elevated cancer rates, premature death from respiratory disease, cancer, chemical exposure, diesel exposure to diesel particulates from transportation sources. It's a pretty serious scenario.
Okay, and then when you add in climate change, it's a new set of issues. And so what new problems do these already exposed communities face?
So even though you have a lot of transportation resources, railroads, byways, truck depots, bus depots in and near these communities, you don't always have access to that public transportation. So when there's rising sea level, when there are devastating and intense storms, just because you have those sources near you doesn't mean that you have access to those sources so that you can get out of harm's way. So that's one issue, right? And we can look at Katrina and Rita, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, to see what the impact is of intensifying hurricanes and storms, that not everybody is going to have the resources to be able to get out of harm's way in a timely fashion and get to safety. Not everybody's going to have the resources to be able to do that. Some people are going to be left behind. And of those people who are going to be left behind, if their homes are not prepared for, intense storms, whether they be winter storms or summer storms, if they're not prepared for intense heat, loss of power, if they don't have those excess resources and those systems, sort of default systems baked in, people are going to suffer and people are going to die. We've seen it happen already, and it's going to intensify.
Great. And Obama's Clean Power Plan does calls for actions to combat climate change at the state level. How is it likely to affect minority and low-income communities?
Well, if you look at the states, for example, there are 26 states that opted not to participate in the Affordable Care Act. And those states, most of those states are in the Deep South, not all of them, but many of them. Their populations don't have access to resources, don't have access to health insurance. Those same states are going to be the ones, or many of them are the ones that are also fighting the Clean Power Plan. So they believe that there is too much federal regulation and that this is not something that the federal government should be regulating. And they also don't believe that climate change and sea level rise is real. So you're going to see those same places trying to opt out. A lot of them are fighting in the courts, are challenging EPA's authority to implement the Clean Power Plan. And in the middle of that are going to be a lot of communities that are in harm's way directly right now and who are already experiencing the impacts of climate change and global warming. That's only going to get worse as folks do not prepare and do not build in these safety systems through the Clean Power Plan. How are they going to reduce carbon emissions? Also, many communities of color are at ground zero for where these carbon emissions are being generated. So the Clean Power Plan, one of the not good things about the Clean Power Plan is that it sets up a credit trading system, an emissions trading system, and to allow companies and producers to reduce their overall levels of climate emissions. But they don't have to get the reductions from the places where the emissions are the highest. They can get it airshed wide, right? So, let's say we're looking at, Baltimore County and its environs. Many of the sources are in Baltimore City, but the reductions will be able to be gotten further away from Baltimore. So people will still have those emissions, they'll still have those exposures, they'll still have the adverse health impacts. And if we don't get specific about making sure that the reductions in carbon emissions are targeted at the places where the emissions are the highest, then we're not going to get the public health benefits that EPA is trying to drive through the implementation of the Clean Power Plan.
Okay, but there are some environmental justice positive elements of the Obama Clean Power Plan,
Sure
right?
There are. Sure there are. But there are also parts of it that really still need work. Making sure that there's input and engagement with all kinds of populations in the development of the state implementation plans, that's a big win, a big step forward, that the state implementation plans have to be able to demonstrate that they've talked to vulnerable populations, that they've had real engagement that's meaningful, and that their plans are based on the output of those dialogues. That's required in the Clean Power Plan, and that's a very, very good thing.
Okay, great. And you were involved with crafting the Maryland plan that I believe it came a little bit before the Obama Act, but then it feeds into the Obama Act.
In Maryland, we have the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, and that is the main vehicle by which the state of Maryland is going to drive carbon reductions in our state. And I was involved in helping to craft the plan, a report that critiques and advocates for various avenues to address inequality, as well as to get greater carbon reductions in the places where those emissions are the highest. So that's the plan that I worked on, the report that I worked on. It's giving the state of Maryland and decision makers a roadmap for how to use the tools that we have to really address inequality, but also to get clean energy benefits to the lowest income strata of our population in the state of Maryland.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Sure.